Japanese internment is a horrible blight on the United States history. It was unconstitutional and was fueled by wartime hysteria with a strong backbone of racism. While many Japanese citizens were bitter about their treatment, most saw themselves as citizens and tried to show their citizenship through wartime service, patriotism, or exercising their rights as Americans to challenge internment. Tensions with Japanese Americans have existed since their first immigration to the United States, but they boiled over for the Japanese when Pearl Harbor was bombed on December 7, 1941. The United States was not in the war at the time, but Japan felt that it was only a matter of time, so took efforts to cripple the Navy of the United States. They sent a declaration of war, but its transmission was bungled so that the United States did not receive it until it was too late. The effects of the attack were devastating. FDR declared the day of the attack a date which would live in infamy, which has become a prophetic statement. Pearl Harbor was a shock to Japanese Americans. The end of the year is traditionally a great celebration for Japanese Americans of the year now past, but the celebration of 1941 was bleak. Christian minister Daisuke Kitagawa recorded that the Japanese community was deeply unsettled by the Pearl Harbor attacks. The FBI at that time had begun roundups of individuals possibly associated with the attacks, though there wasn't much distinction drawn. The Japanese community felt that such acts might have been justifiable if their hearts had been with Japan, but because most of their hearts were with the United States, they felt great betrayal. Fear grew quickly among the Japanese community. Citizens and aliens feared that they might be taken as others had already had. Even ministers like Daisuke feared to make visits with their congregations in case they were associated with suspected traitors. Daisuke at the time retained his faith in American fairness, but that was not true for all. Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066 on February 9, 1942, which displaced thousands of Japanese Americans into inland internment camps. The order led to the relocation of 110,000 people, the largest migration in United States history. The order did not specifically stipulate the Japanese, but was enforced that way. General DeWitt wanted to also remove German and Italian aliens, but was denied by the government, who only wanted one group of people en masse to be removed. The removal included the entire state of California, the western coastal parts of Oregon and Washington, and the southern half of Arizona. The conditions of the camps were very difficult. Yoshiko Uchida described an event at the camps when she was first being brought to the building she would be schooled in. When brought by the white teacher to a school building, Uchida describes what they found. We were shocked to discover that the school barracks were absolutely bare. No stoves, no tables or chairs, no light bulbs, no supplies, no equipment of any kind. The teacher then invited Uchiha to her quarters, which were comfortable and fully furnished. The contrast and hypocrisy shocked her. The teacher had been brought in to teach the children of Topaz, and while the teachers were given comfort, the children were given nothing. Despite difficult living conditions, Japanese Americans tried their best to show their love for their country, even as their speech was stifled and censored. A large internment camp, Tule Lake's local Japanese newspaper tells an interesting story. Chul One Solomon Park argues that although the paper seems like one you would find anywhere, it was controlled by the camp authorities, which stifled the true feelings of its writers. An article published 1 year after Pearl Harbor illustrates this tension well. The article claims that Americans, even before Pearl Harbor, sympathized with the Allied powers, and Americans after the attack pledged their complete loyalty to the war. The article stated that the Nisei were also contributing. Nisei is a way of saying second-generation Japanese American. Ni meaning two in Japanese. There are Nisei, second generation, and Isai, first generation. Ichi meaning one. The article said that 5,000 Nisei were fighting for the war. The tension is best summarized in the last lines of the article. If this is total war, then it is total war for every American. We are asking the same right as other Americans. Total participation in total war. This should give us our rightful place when peace is won. Even with censoring, the defiance and desire to be seen as Americans is clear, and they wish to win it by participating in war. Others fought for citizenship by exercising American legal rights. Toyasabaru Korimatsu was born in the United States January 30th, 1919. He was a Nisei and everyone called him Fred in place of his Japanese name. When Order 9066 came out, he tried to escape notice for a time but was unsuccessful. He was placed in federal prison in San Francisco for trying to conceal his race. Korimatsu was visited by an attorney for the American Civil Liberties Union of Northern California, Ernest Bissig. Bissig wanted to do a test to challenge Order 9066 and thought Korimatsu's case fit. Korimatsu agreed and began a lifetime journey for civil rights. He was found guilty but continued to appeal. The case made it to the Supreme Court, and on December 18, 1944, in a 6-3 decision, the court found Korimatsu guilty, justifying the decision based on the national emergency. A pro-conviction justice, Hugo Black, agreed with the military that it was impossible to bring about an immediate segregation of disloyal from loyal. A justice which dissented, Frank Murphy, wrote, "This exclusion falls into an ugly abyss of racism. The reason for the exclusion appeared to be largely an accumulation of much misinformation, half-truths, and insinuations accusations that for years have been directed against Japanese Americans by people with racial and economic prejudices. I dissent, therefore, from the legalization of racism. It wasn't until much later that Japanese Americans received some redress when Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, which acknowledged that the removal had been unreasonable. The injustice in Japanese internment has modern parallels, particularly with regards to habeas corpus, or the right to a trial before imprisonment. The same issue of imprisonment without trial took place with prisoners in Guantanamo Bay. Harvey Gee makes the argument that Japanese Americans during Order 9066 and Guantanamo Bay detainees today were not afforded basic procedural safeguards that are supposed to be afforded to criminal defendants in federal court. In federal court, detainees could contest their detention using a writ of habeas corpus, but in the case of the Japanese now Guantanamo Bay detainees, the length of waiting made these writs futile. If the nation wants to avoid other issues of mass imprisonment in the future, the court must change to prevent this injustice. Before the passage of the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians reported on why Japanese internment happened. They found that the internment was carried out without proof of espionage, sabotage, or disloyalty from Japanese Americans, or Japanese aliens. There was no military or security reason for the internment. That it stemmed from racial prejudice, war hysteria, and failure of political leadership, that those affected suffered enormous damages, material and intangible, and that basic civil liberties and constitutional rights were violated by the internment. The bill awarded $20,000 to each person who was detained and was still alive, and for families of those deceased. While the United States later admitted fault for exclusion, the very idea that this could ever happen is reprehensible, and speaks poorly for the nation's treatment of its citizens that are not white Protestants. Justice Murphy described the internment's justification well as he said, "This exclusion falls into the ugly abyss of racism. I dissent, therefore, from this legalization of racism. Our nation cannot justify its actions when they are based on racism. We must stop this injustice by looking within ourselves and by enacting legislation to ensure that change."